Welcome back from the holiday break, little helpers. Today we are doing an episode on judgmentalness. This is something that is so pervasive in our society. I feel like over the past 10 years it's gotten so bad. And it's also something that's highly associated with anxiety and depression. I think pathology in general. And that's really interesting to think about as we see that, things like social media, which is a highly judgmental platform, people flinging judgment at each other all the time. Social media is something that is so used by middle schoolers, high schoolers, and we see that in that generation, or in that cohort of people, specifically mental health is tanking. So it's really important when we talk about mental health to talk about judgmentalness. And we're going to talk about it, how and why we judge others, ourselves, even our emotions. So Kibby, what's good and bad about being judgmental? What are the two sides of this coin?
Yeah, if we're going to break down what is a judgment, of course, that it could be used in all sorts of ways, but what we're talking about here is when someone sees an ambiguous situation or a situation with a lot of different information, like you are on a date and you try to figure out this person's someone you want to date, or you got some feedback about your own behavior, got some grades, or if you go for a job opportunity and you're kind of figuring out whether you're right for the job, or what are your chances of getting the job, or even looking at someone on social media, as you're saying, and figuring out if you like this person or not, right? You're coming into this kind of new situation and making an evaluation on it, right? Forming an opinion on something. And we know from the judgment decision-making literature that a lot of time, this is what our brains do. This is what our brains are made to do. We're dealing with the whole world, all of this uncertainty, all of these question marks. You don't know the future. You can't predict what people are going to do. You got to figure out what's good or bad and what you should approach or avoid with very little information sometimes. And our brains are constantly doing that, and they're making shortcuts in order to do that, right? If you're sitting with a new date, it would be nice if you had all of the information. You got their whole profile, LinkedIn, Facebook, you got their CV, you got all of the reports from their exes, right? Their whole life story. It'd be great if you had all that, but you have to make a decision on what you got, right?
Yeah.
And so our brains are really good at trying to figure out, what information is going to be a red flag or something that I like, and how do I make a decision based on that? So we're trying to making those snap decisions or judgments based on evaluating what information we have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, without judgment, we would never get through our day. We wouldn't get through a trip to the grocery store. We would be reading the backs of, the nutritional labels on absolutely everything that we read. We need to be able to make quick decisions. So being judgmental, in a sense, is enormously helpful to us. It becomes bad, I suppose, when, I guess that's hard to define, really. But if we tend to have a negative bias, which I believe is almost everybody has somewhat of a negative bias, right? Because our brains are conditioned to look for threat more than reward.
Yeah. This is what we say to our patients all the time, is that our brains are making judgments, but primarily to keep us alive. Yeah. And for many, many years before we're, kind of in the safe society, it's really about how do we detect danger? Mm-hmm. And it makes more sense to detect even the littlest risk of danger than just to be open-minded and go free and take those risks. So if we see something and go, oh, I think that's bad, I think that's a bear that's come to kill me, that judgment is going to keep us alive. So yeah, our brains are a little bit more skewed to figuring out what's bad.
Yeah. And that's important to note, too, that we're a social species. We need to be able to fit in order to survive. And so it makes sense then that threat detection would apply to, being around that person, being associated with that person might lead to social exclusion. And so I think especially in time periods where our peers are extremely important, it makes sense to be more judgmental. So like middle and high school, you know, we are learning what it means to be part of a group, to affiliate, to be accepted or excluded. And so our threat detection is much higher. And so we might be more judgmental towards others.
Yeah. And it makes sense that now, it was interesting that you were saying that we're having mental health issues like on the skyrocketing now, right? Especially with the younger generation. And in these situations where like, I feel like we're all exposed to so much more stuff, so much more information and people and things than ever before. And it's also very scary. Like we have war, you know, and we've always had war, but there's a lot of huge threats out there. The economy's not great. Like a lot of political systems, our current systems are very dangerous and we don't know what's happening. We don't have a sense of safety. So when we look on all the people that we have on social media, we have to kind of come up with shortcuts to be like, that's a bad person. That's a good person. Is that person on our side and in our tribe, or is it an outsider? And do we hate that outsider and cut them off, right? So,
yeah, well, I mean, especially as the risk of social exclusion is so punishing, like with cancel culture, for instance. You know, I mean, we have to be really, really careful about who we affiliate with. I mean, I remember when I first came off The Bachelor, people with really high followings were getting skewered just for like following an account of somebody, you know, of a quote, dangerous political persuasion. They might have been following that person because I followed Trump, you know, back when he was on Twitter. It's like, I hate Trump, but it's interesting to see how he's communicating. But like even having the affiliation of like following an account could get you in trouble. And so I can imagine people becoming even more defensively judgmental under those circumstances. So there is this sense of, okay, if I have to be alert to threat, and so I'm going to make quick judgments about that person's bad. There's something, the research has actually shown that you get a boost of oxytocin when you're negatively judgmental towards others. So this is a rewarding experience for us. And yeah, I mean, I think there is a sense in which if we can, condemn somebody else or lower somebody else in our estimation, then we ourselves rise in our own estimation or in others. You know, if I'm talking to you and we're shit-talking another person, we're kind of putting ourselves above that person naturally. And maybe that's just gratifying in and of itself. Yeah.
I mean, does it say that you feel that boost of oxytocin? Is oxytocin or dopamine?
It was oxytocin. Yeah. This was a one-off line in a paper about something else. So I'm not sure how much further.
Is it about when you negatively judge someone else, or?
I believe so.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting too, because I guess it's like, I would just, even just like picturing myself in a situation where I judge something, it's much more scary for people to be in an uncertain situation, right? Mm-hmm. If you're like trying to figure out if you like this person or not, is this person you should trust? Mm-hmm. Or if you have a weird feeling about them, but you're not exactly sure why, but you're doubting yourself, like if you're in this state of like, haven't made a decision about someone, it might feel relieving and good to be like, I get it. They're a bad person. This is why I don't like them. Or so I can imagine that you might feel good because you've like resolved the uncertainty, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it makes some sense that if you're anxious and depressed, you know, your threat detectors are even more up. This person might hurt me. If you can make a quick negative judgment, you can push them away, create distance between you, and then you don't risk, you know, being hurt in some way by that other person. And so there is literal safety in that negative judgment. Especially if you have very low self-esteem, right? Like the more people you let into your circle, if you have low self-esteem, the more opportunities you have to be hurt if a bad apple slips in a sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah. I mean, you're trying to keep yourself safe, and you're also bonding yourself to like the people who are good versus people who are bad. So it's like, ding, it's the judgment system is working. But there are a lot of people who go like, they beat themselves up for being so judgmental. or they're wondering like when is it actually good to be judgmental, right? And as we mentioned, like you're getting mental shortcuts, so you're not spending a lot of time deliberating and wondering, and you're just like kind of going through your day a little bit more efficiently. So that's what judgments are good for. But also, it's what we're saying is like it sometimes keeps you safe from the bad things, right? And so you get, a lot of people might be bummed out about it, but it actually is protecting you in some ways. But on the other side, what you're doing is that you're just disregarding a ton of information, right? Shortcuts are shortcuts for a reason, and you're shortcutting over other stuff that might have been actually important. So if you find yourself narrowing your life to maybe dating the same kind of people, making the same mistakes, cutting out a lot of people before giving them a chance, right? This is where a judgmentalness can come up, where, someone finds themselves like really picky at dating or really picky with friends or jobs or something like that. And they might be feeling safe with their judgments, like, oh, okay, I'm not going to date or involve myself with anyone who's below the certain standard. But at the same time, that could really keep you closed off from a lot of opportunities, right?
It can keep you closed off, and I think it also creates this world where a lot of judgment exists. So, for instance, if you spend a lot of time harshly judging others, it then becomes more and more believable that those others spend a lot of time harshly judging you. That the world is a very judgmental place. And so that can make you really shut down, be very self-conscious about all sorts of things. I mean, I remember back when I was way more judgmental, like in my early 20s or teens, I was worried about hairs being out of place, like so terrified that something wasn't perfect about me. Like if I went on a date, for instance. And now I look like a bag lady when I go to the grocery store, or it just doesn't matter as much to me, right?
Yeah.
Another thing that's interesting, if I think about like when we need to make quick decisions and when we need to make slower decisions, I would probably make a slower decision about somebody who I had to spend a lot of time with, like a coworker, because then I'm gonna have time to incorporate more information. It makes more sense that I would get to know them better, and it would make sense to make faster judgments about people that are much more in my periphery. And that I'm just kind of having this half-baked thought now, but like that kind of reminds me of stereotyping. If there are people, for instance, from another culture that you don't interact with much, it makes more sense to immediately judge because, you know what I mean?
You're just given very little information about someone, and you have to be like, am I going to trust them? And unfortunately, that is really reducing a person to like one quality, right?
Right. And if we already have an automatic negative bias, then that raises the chances for a negative bias towards an outgroup. And then if we think about if the group that's judging has low mental health, low self-esteem, I mean, we see this happening right now in like poor white rural America, this like kind of downtrodden, angry, depressed, addicted group, then those negative biases are going to be so much stronger and more automatic.
Yeah. When we mention biases, I mean, biases is a really common term we talk about in the judgment decision-making research. Bias is basically the tendency to make a certain type of evaluation. So if you have a negative bias, which we say all the time, you have a tendency to evaluate something as like bad, not good, negative, right? So if I'm like coming into a new social situation and I'm like, that person hates me, no matter, and I do that no matter what, no matter who I'm hanging out with, I'm just like, they probably hate me, they probably don't like me. That's a negative bias of when you're trying to make judgments about how people feel about you,
Yeah. So I don't know. I would say that's a danger. I had a patient once who, in the beginning of our work together, would say like, they were very lonely and they didn't have a ton of friends, but they were very likable. But this was like a depression sort of self-esteem thing. And we'd talk about making friends and they'd be like, well, when I go in a room, I just don't like anybody, And I'm like, if somebody's wearing like an obscure band t-shirt that I like, then I'll be like, all right, that's the one person I can talk to. So, but it's like, we talked about how that was sort of setting booby traps for loneliness. I mean, it's like these people would have to wear the exact right t-shirt to even be considered a friend, and that's a way to keep yourself distant and therefore not hurt by others, I think. And not that this was going on with this person, but I would think for people who have been ostracized or put down or not seen as cool by others, then they might make their own subgroup and decide to negatively judge the people who had negatively judged them. And so that's another thing that might make them feel better, is like, well, fuck you, I don't like you either. Or anybody that has markers that resemble you.
Well, it's also putting judgmentalness in that case you were talking about it's like a form of control, right? It's a form of like avoidance of uncertainty, avoidance of like, maybe I'll have to talk to everyone here and see if I have a connection with anyone, which opens you up for a lot of pain, potential judgment of yourself, like potential rejection, wasting your time, like, I don't know, but it seems like that person will feel like very in control of like, I get to select. Do you pass my bar? If so, then I could talk to you. If not, then I get to reject you before anything bad happens, right? And for a lot of people, that leads to like never finding that person with the same t-shirt.
Yeah. I saw, I was just doing some reading, and a couple of papers were talking about if you want to stop judging so harshly, to kind of say to that judgmental voice, thank you for trying to protect me. Because that's what it's doing. It's not, you're not a bad person for judging others. It's just maybe you have some defenses up. You're trying to protect yourself, and acknowledging that instead of adding judgment, like, oh, how could I be so shitty that I judged? Thank you yourself for trying. Yeah,
like we're weaving in tips on how to deal with judgmentalness, but like, I mean, it's even just acknowledging that there's benefits to the judgments, or at least it's doing something, right? It's anything we do, especially when we talk about patients and like the different kind of patterns they tend to have, or biases, or whatever things that's getting in the way of their life. Like the first thing we like to do is, first of all, help them be aware of it, but also see the other side. Like, why do we have this judgment? Why are we have this tendency to judge people negatively? What is it doing for you? Just like you're saying, like, what's the benefit? Like, what if I didn't judge, what am I risking or losing here?
Do are there times you notice yourself getting particularly judgmental? Are there things you're particularly judgmental of besides your own work ethic?
I was trying to think about that. I think that I tend to, it's weird because I feel like I do have a high self-esteem, or I feel like I feel confident in my skills in many ways, but I like, if I brought the example of like applying for jobs and things like that and judging your own worth, and I tend to devalue myself quite a bit. Like I tend to assume that I've less qualifications than other people, fewer chances of being like seen as attractive or valuable. I kind of have a more pessimistic judgment of like, I'm not going to get, things are not going to work out for me. I'm not going to reach success.
And how does that serve you?
I think it makes me constantly work. It makes me constantly fight to be better. And I get reinforced for doing that. I also probably get reinforced for not being arrogant or confident. Like I don't brag about myself, or I try not to, at least, or I try not to go into situations feeling like I'm top dog anywhere, because that opens me up for rejection, which would be painful. And I'm afraid of people seeing me or seeing that quality as bad. So,
well, women can't be overly confident.
Exactly. Well, I mean, for real, like I think there must be there's something reinforcing about always going into situations being like assuming the worst of my chances and myself compared to other people. So but it makes me just constantly feel like crap. So
yeah, I mean, I would imagine it feels protective, because it's like, okay, I won't get my hopes up too much, or I won't feel like a fool when I'm rejected. But the fallacy of that is that you spend so much time feeling bad up front that the math doesn't really work out, because then you still feel rejected afterwards, and you have to add that those bad feelings to the bad feelings you created in the first place.
Yeah, and the thing is that I don't think I would change or work on my judgmentalness of myself in that way, because as it is now, it's not really getting in the way of the things that I want in life. And so that's the way to kind of evaluate to judge your own judgmentalness. But to figure out if you're like, quote, too judgmental, it's like, are these judgments leading me to something that I value and care about, and leading me to like my goals in life, or is it keeping me from it? So if it were like, if I would judge myself so poorly that I wouldn't go for job opportunities or new ventures, then I would have to look at myself and say, okay, how can I rejig and revamp the way I'm thinking about this thing, and kind of open my mind up and get rid of these judgments. But so far it hasn't stopped me.
What about all the stories you've told about how you just work and work and work and work and work, and then you burn out and you just have to watch TV, and then hate yourself? Is that not getting in the way of anything?
No, that's perfectly fine. Yeah.
It's perfectly fine. Okay. Kippy's got a little bit further to walk on this journey before she realizes how it's hurting her.
That's true. Okay. Because I value academic or professional success so much, it has not gotten in the way of that, because I still go for things. But you're right, it has gotten in the way of like my personal life and happiness, where I feel like I'm constantly doubting how productive I am.
Well, those aren't important.
Those are not important. You know. Today, like other podcast episodes, I've been like, I gotta have more work-life balance. Today, I'm just like, no, it's good that I don't think I'm good enough.
Yeah. Are there things you judge in others that you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, it's going to be weird. I mean, I do have to say no in many ways. Like, I feel like I do pride myself on that I don't tend to... When I meet someone new, I usually think the best of them, or I usually think good things about new people, right? I tend to like different people. I generally think that I don't have like very specific criteria to like judge people on, like, oh, if they're only from, this part of society, or this kind of person, or these interests, or this like political stance, that they're good or bad. Like, I feel like I'm pretty open-minded, but I do have to say that if I hear that someone is coming from like a good like educational background, or especially now in psychology, if they come from certain kind of training, or they've been trained in science or something like that, I'm a little bit more like, they know what they're talking about. Or I'm more likely to want to listen to what they have to say about like mental health and those kind of topics, because I feel like in the mental health world out there, there's like such a variety of people practicing or preaching or teaching all sorts of stuff about psychology. And I feel like I've learned to be very judgmental about like, our training is very good, and people with similar training are also very good, right?
Yeah, I think across the board, you tend to be judgmental of people who are full of shit. Like, I can think of a fitness account, where
Yeah, that's true. I think okay, you're right. I'm more judgmental than I thought. If there's someone out there that I think is doing something for the sake of like public appearance with no substance behind it, I get very judgmental about that, because I get very judgmental of the pursuit of like maybe just attention seeking for the sake of attention seeking, without any like other thing that they want to contribute to society or like back that up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think people in general tend to be pretty judgmental of trying too hard. And that's why we have the word cringe, which is like the most judgmental word that we have,
Maybe that'll be the title of this episode.
Cringe.
What about you? What kind of judgments do you have?
Well, that's certainly one of them. I mean, because as soon as somebody can walk in and I might perceive them as annoying, or like not that smart, or wearing something stupid, whatever. But as soon as they if they're able to have like a truly authentic 5 minutes with me, then my opinion will change dramatically. But I think as people that I think I judge people as kind of cool or uncool. And that doesn't mean in the classic high school American way of like, oh, like your clothes aren't cool, then you're not cool. But yeah, as people who are trying too hard for attention, or people who maybe conform with what they think is going to get them positive attention in a way that just screams attention seeking or trying too hard, whatever. Like I'm thinking kind of some people from the Bachelor franchise. And of course, like I got these judgments and that was so enormously painful. Like she's trying so hard. She's pretentious. She's trying to prove she's smart, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, in some ways I was, because I didn't know what the fuck I was doing, you know? And I was like, people were telling me what to do. They were telling me how to craft a brand. I'm like, okay, it didn't feel authentic.
Oh, interesting.
So that
this is after The Bachelor, or this is on The Bachelor?
After The Bachelor. Yeah. I don't think I was inauthentic at all. I don't think I was necessarily inauthentic much. I think it was just like the whole idea of posting on Instagram was kind of inauthentic to me. It still kind of is. But I'll often judge people as annoying. But I don't often judge behavior. Like, and by that I mean, did they do something right or wrong? Sometimes I'll be like, oh, what they did was annoying. It's almost more of a, it's offending my senses sort of thing. And I'm like, well, how does that serve me? I don't know. I mean, I know I felt uncool growing up, and I desperately wanted to be cool. And so maybe judging others that way allows me to feel elevated in some sense. And also, I think research has shown that like shit talking bonds people. And so I've definitely caught myself shit talking or gossiping. But I am not judgmental of, you know, if somebody behaved badly, like in a way that other people would judge. I tend not to judge that very much.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that is something that's different between you and me. I am very judgmental when it comes to people who have like hurt others, or has behaved in ways I feel like is like destructive without accounting for the consequences. Or like I sometimes, maybe not with patients, but in my personal life, when I see that, I'm just like, you're a dick, you're gone, you're dead to me. Like, and then it's really hard for me to get back from that. But for you, I feel like we were talking about this earlier, where you have this like almost like too nice of a judgment towards people who might be doing really hurtful behavior towards others.
Yeah. Specifically myself.
Yeah. I mean, if people are hurting you, I feel like I've seen you have a positive bias, like an overly positive bias, where you're like, you know what? It's not their fault. I did it. It's because I did something, and it's not their fault that they. Well, I don't know. Why don't you speak to that judgment? Because I feel like you tend to blame yourself over other people. Yeah,
I mean, for one thing, philosophically speaking, I don't really believe in morality, and so that leads me to. I think of actions as like having consequences, and that people are going to act in ways that are good and bad, but good and bad aren't very well defined. It's kind of like, okay, what consequences happened to whom? Was there an understandable reason why they did this? Were they trying their best? Whatever. And I tend to have a bias where I think that most people are trying their best and decent human beings most of the time. And I think that helps me as a therapist, because people can tell me shit and I just don't even flinch, you know? So I think patients feel very safe disclosing things to me, because judging behavior as good or bad has never felt interesting to me. I think the cool versus uncool thing, which I can do away with there have been so many people I've been like, cringe or annoying or uncool, and then they have an authentic 5 minutes with me and I'm like, you're my best friend, you're totally cool, you know? And I think patients are in a situation where they're automatically authentic. Not everyone, of course, but I think by and large, they're coming to you for a reason, you know? And when people disclose things they're ashamed of, that they often do it in a moment of disclosure or authenticity or something like that. And so then I find it very easy to just not judge at all and kind of, just hear them out and ascribe goodwill to them. It gets in the way when people have done shitty things to me and I automatically ascribe blame to myself, because I just assume, oh, well, they didn't do this through malice. They didn't do this because they're a bad person. I don't believe in bad people. And they're not a psychopath. That's like as close to an objective form of a bad person I can think of, right? So obviously they did this in context, and I was part of that context, and so I have some responsibility here, which I think is a good way of looking at things a lot of the time. But maybe it tends to draw out relationships because I refuse to lay proper blame. I keep giving excuses. Yeah. I don't really know what to do about that. I mean, I'm trying to get actually a little bit more judgmental with some people, specifically men. Yeah. But it's hard to want to be more judgmental.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost kind of like we're saying you getting more discriminating over behavior that's discriminating it over whether something is your fault or someone else's fault or what fault is. I feel like you're probably, your shame response is probably so high that you have this bias of it's my fault. I'm bad. I'm the bad one. But if you kind of do, if you applied what you do for other people to yourself, there'll probably be more situations where it's a balanced of oh, actually I did screw up here and this is what I can do to change that, and other times I didn't screw up. It's actually the other person's fault. I was just saying that not only will it help you keep other people accountable, but it might actually be more effective for you to correct your behavior that you actually think it's bad, right?
Because I won't be so admired in, oh my God, everything I do is bad, or what?
Kind of, because if it's this sweeping generalized judgment that kind of takes out all the complexities of the situation. I mean, I'm just talking about based on observing you. A lot of these circumstances, you kind of difficult situations, conflicts with friends or loved ones, I'm talking about, you'll assume the worst in yourself, oh, that it is my fault. I deserve the bad thing that happened to me, without having a little bit more of a balanced view of wait a minute, some things I screw up and some things it's the other person's fault, right? So you're kind of reducing a lot of complexity into just I'm bad. They have reasons for doing what they're doing. I'm still hurt though, right?
Yeah, it's almost like when it's a lower level thing, okay, we got in a fight over the dishes. I'd be more likely to be no, that was his fuck up versus mine. When it's a higher thing that I think comes with an attachment, let's say, this is not something that's happened to me. Let's say a guy pushed me, right? I can imagine myself saying, oh, well, he did that because I yelled in his face and he needed to get me away from him, right? So I would create a story where I deserve to be pushed, or what he did was not because he's physically abusive. And I think I would be avoiding that because the label, abusive would feel too big. I wouldn't, and that kind of goes back to my amorality thing. I never want to label people as good or bad.
Except yourself.
Yeah, sure.
So what would it be like to get rid of those judgments? What if you actually were no, that person pushed me and they're wrong and they're bad for doing so? What do you think would change, or what do you think you'd be losing or risking if you stopped blaming yourself and started blaming the other person?
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to say the exact thing that we're talking about. Kibby and I are basically talking in veiled language about something that I've been working through with her. It just feels, there's something in me that's really pushing back. I'm it's...
So
it
speak from that thing. What is that besides saying?
That they couldn't have been that bad of a person. Or there's too much context there. There's too much complexity there. How could I possibly remove like the parts of me that were in that context. I'm not thinking of myself as a bad person, though.
Right. What do you think about describing what that other person did was bad behavior? Like, what if you're just like, that person was just wrong? Maybe not like a bad person, but like that behavior was bad.
I think I'm there.
Okay.
Yeah. I think this transitions nicely actually into trauma. She says with a wry laugh. So one thing that we learn when, treating patients with trauma is that when you undergo something, you have these natural feelings. If you were assaulted, it makes sense to have felt fear, violation, hurt, anger. But then you have these kind of secondary feelings that often come later that actually fuel the trauma response. So that's often shame, guilt, regret, and a lot of that comes from judging the self. So saying I was to blame for what happened. So if you think of somebody who is in the military whose, tank got shot up by the enemy and they survived and no one else did. The natural feelings would be grief, sadness, fear, anger, whatever. But if they then say, I should have been able to prevent this, or why was I the one who lived? It should have been somebody else who lived, somebody more important than me. Those are like emotional logs that you're adding to this like traumatic fire that just keeps it burning and burning and burning. And so that's also a problem with judgment.
Yeah. Yeah, judgments are a really good segue into how judgments and judgmentalness fit into mental health. I mean, as you're suggesting, there's judgmentalness in all sorts of disorders: trauma, anxiety, depression, emotional disorders, and things like that. And there's actually, in terms of trauma and PTSD, there's a treatment called cognitive processing therapy that tackles this directly. So if people go through a trauma, the theory is like, if someone goes through a trauma, they're like, how could this happen, right? I thought the world was good and I thought things were just, and this terrible, terrible thing happened. I got to make sense of this. I got to change the way I see the world and myself in order to make this make sense. So you start to develop these judgments like, I'm at fault all the time, or I'm a bad person. That's why I was, sexually assaulted, or I opened myself up to this kind of person. That's why this terrible thing happened to me. So you start to make rules and start to make those kind of mental shortcuts in order to keep yourself safe, right? This is kind of ripe for judgment, this area where it's like, you are trying to keep yourself safe. There's a lot of information out there. Some things are dangerous. You didn't know why that dangerous thing happened to you. So you're trying to get some control over it by being like, you know what? In that case, I'll just never date again. So I'll never be hurt again. Right. And so the judgment has a big role in trauma.
Well, yeah, I mean, it can also be tempting to place blame on yourself because you have much more control over yourself than anybody else. So if you can make something your fault, then you can prevent it from happening again. So, I mean, that happens all the time with sexual assault. I shouldn't have gotten so drunk. I shouldn't have worn what I was wearing. I shouldn't have flirted, whatever, because you can change all those things the next time, but you can't change whether a stranger is a piece of shit,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
there's trauma, and it definitely, there's a really nice review paper that we'll link on the website, but judgmentalness is a really big, and also leads to anxiety and depression, and like major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders. And the literature is showing that specifically the uncontrollable judgments. So if you even have a goal to do a task that's like, why don't you look at these different things and figure out what's good or bad, and like try to be accurate with it, right? People who have anxiety and depression tend to just go for the bad thing. They selectively attend to bad or negative information. They tend to remember things that are that in their past and really like narrow their attention on negative things in their present. So,
Yeah.
and they can't control it in these studies. So even if they didn't want to look at the bad thing, they're looking at the bad thing. So, yeah, even that kind of style of like negative bias in judgments, that is supposed to actually put you at more risk for depression and anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, the theme running through this is our judgments are meant to keep us safe. They're meant to protect us, but in a lot of cases, they wind up really sinking us because they force us to live in a world that's filled with judgments and therefore filled with negativity, with landmines, like, oh my God, if I'm judging myself this harshly, or if I'm judging others this harshly, they're judging me this harshly. They can increase our guilt and shame. They can make it hard to heal. And there's all these negative effects. And yet, of course, it's something that we need to keep doing to a certain extent. It's just looking at how far has this taken me down a bad road? Where is this interfering in my life? And yeah, maybe first thanking yourself for, okay, these are attempts to keep myself safe. Thank you. I got it. I'm going to take it from here.
So not only does judgmentalness kind of have such an important role in having a mental health disorder, but, as we're talking to our little helpers, it really has a big role in being a loved one of someone with mental health issues. And I think both of us can definitely relate. But if you have a loved one, like a parent, a family member, a friend, or spouse, or struggling with mental health issues, you have probably gone through a lot of pain yourself. You've gone through a lot of hardship. And it might be really hard. You might develop almost kind of like the stigma, like a negative bias towards that other person. Like, they're acting funny again. I bet they're drinking again. Like, oh, they're depressed. They're probably not going to do anything today, right? We're making these shortcuts based on old pain, and maybe assuming, I don't know, the worst, but at least you might make judgments based on like their mental health issues and assuming that those issues that they had in the past are what's going to happen in the future, which not only locks you into these judgments, but it kind of locks the relationship in this pattern of like, that person and your relationship is defined and narrowed by the illness,
Yeah, it's so tricky because you might be right 90% of the time. I think there's maybe something we need to get here where it's like, if you can get your judgments to not be 100% locked in, like they must be drinking right now, and you can say, well, they might be drinking right now. That's a much more flexible judgment that allows for some openness, it allows for some understanding, some empathy, some positivity towards the other person, some hope there, while still recognizing like, yeah, but I'm not going to be a Pollyanna every day I wake up, I'm going to recognize that like, yeah, there are patterns that are associated with this disorder.
Yeah, I mean, the hope is the big thing, right? It's like, I was thinking about when my mom recovered from alcoholism, like she got treatment and quit drinking. And I know, like I know this logically that if someone is recovering from mental health issues, especially substance abuse, it's really hard for them to integrate that change in their social network, right? They're so used to seeing them in a particular way. It's hard for them to grow and change because people are going to assume something, right? Assume like, the bad things that happened in the past are going to happen again. And I found that really hard to not be as judgmental towards my mother. And, as soon as we get to a fight, be like, oh, she's just going to do this and this and this. I can't talk to her. It was really hard for me to kind of like lower that judgment and be like, okay, I went to the shortcut that I always go to, like just run away from this, protect yourself. But that was really preventing us from like developing a new relationship.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I could feel like judgmentalness was like a big barrier for even her growth, Yeah,
I mean, negative judgments are always distancing. Even when we judge ourselves, there's this sense that like a part of us is trying to push away this hated part, this part that we're disappointed with in ourselves. So I think it can often feel protective to push away somebody who's disordered in our life. Because they've caused so much pain. But the question is, do you want there to be a chance of a continued relationship? Do you, do you want to build closeness more than you want to push yourself away from the pain? No. Yeah. And so are you going to be able to give them a chance and think about them flexibly enough? And I think it is hard. Like my sister, when she was in the early stages of recovery, it was really easy to just write it off. If there was a relapse, yep, this is going to keep happening forever. You had to like keep that window open for, no, wait a minute, there's hope here.
Yeah. I mean, so that it's like, well, what do we do about it? This is a good time for tips, because I feel like no hope if we are that judgmental, because it's like, okay, what do we do when our minds are automatically making these like snap judgments? Like once you have a shortcut, it's really hard to undo. So
yeah. I actually think this is a topic with a lot of hope. There's a lot of tips, and same tips that can stop worrying in its tracks. I mean, so various ways to be cognitively flexible, and then some diffusion techniques. I will just go ahead with some diffusion techniques because I think they're fun. But if you can notice that judgmental voice, you can do things like anthropomorphizing it. I often turn it into a dragon or a goblin or, some sort of stupid animal. And I like to throw popcorn at it, or like just really create a cartoon, of this character. For people who judge themselves really harshly, I ask them if they have a politician that they really hate. It's always Trump, So it's like, you can imagine him as Trump, and it's like, okay, how much do you want to listen to Trump? I know he says things that sound he doesn't, but some, hated politicians sound things that sound believable to a lot of people. But are you going to believe it? Or are you going to rise above that? So there's that technique. You can write down the judgments and say them out loud in a stupid voice. You can write a judgment down and put it in your pocket. So it's like, okay, I hear you. I've got it. You're with me, but I don't need to hold on to this so tightly mentally. And my favorite current tip is you can plan this one in advance. If you kind of have a running script for what your judgments, and you can use this with worries too, but we'll just stick with judgments, what your judgments are going to look like. Like if you have, like if your name is Kibby and you've got a job interview coming up and you can pretty much predict that you're going to say things like, I'm never going to get this job. I'm too unqualified. What am I thinking? Like, it's embarrassing that I'm even applying. I have no credentials, even though I have a PhD from Duke. If you can pretty much predict those are the things you're going to say,
it's like
you can make a
checklist. Done. You already did it for me.
I should have worked harder. I shouldn't have watched TV yesterday. I shouldn't have gotten married or had a baby because my personal life doesn't even matter. It's all
so
about work.
Painfully true.
You can write that down, and then when that interview gets closer and closer and those judgmental things come, you can pull that out and literally check them off. There's some comedy, in noticing like, God, I am so predictable. Like, yep, there's that one. Oh, all right. You kind of beat your mind to the, to the chase. What's the expression? So those are my tips.
Yeah, I like that. All these cognitive diffusion techniques, or the ones you were describing, are ways that like you can get awareness around your judgmental thoughts, right? Like you kind of, and take a step back from them. So you're not just like sucked into them thinking their judgments. You kind of step back and go, oh, okay, that part of my brain is like doing its thing. Yeah. And I'm not going to let it affect my behavior. So that's like the key part of those exercises, how they're helpful.
Yeah, I like also an exercise where, we call it leaves on the stream, but this can be used in a lot of different ways. If I like close my eyes and I think of these judgmental thoughts, like I'll take one, I'm incompetent. That's my number one judgmental thought towards myself. And I pull that thought in really, really close. So it's right in front of my face. Like maybe it's written on a leaf and I pull it into my face. And I let myself experience what it's like for that thought to just take over completely. Like what my body feels like, what my mind feels like what's that like? And I really get acquainted with that. And then I start pulling it away and I start to feel the changes that are associated with that. That's kind of a way to feel that you're actually more in control of your thoughts than maybe you assumed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
like that.
And I kind of play with it. Like, okay, what does this thought feel like at this distance? What about at this distance? What about if I let it wash down the stream with Donald Trump, like treating it like a little rowboat? Like, then do I feel it at all? So, yeah.
I like that. And especially if you do this for real, like you actually write them down on a piece of paper. Other tips from CBT in general is like thinking about like what judgments do. They narrow your mind to an opinion, right? A valuation of what's good or bad. So one of the tips that we get from DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, it's kind of a mindfulness skill, and it's basically like taking things that you normally judge and describing them in really concrete, objective terms. So our minds have gotten so good at judging that you could look at something and be like, that person's crazy, that person's beautiful, that person's awesome, that person's cool, they're not cool, right? You automatically, when you see a new thing, you write it off as good or bad. But if you practice being very descriptive, I like to describe it as if you're a baby or an alien discovering this thing for the first time. Like, how would you actually describe this thing? So instead of looking at a person and being like, she hates me, she's thinking the worst of me, you could be like, she's not making eye contact with me, and she's looking downwards and away from me. Right? So you're breaking down like the opinions and interpretations that your mind is lumping on to the actual facts of the situation. Right?
Yeah.
So there's that. And another one is just like remembering that if judgments narrow our minds to like one piece of information, broadening our minds to kind of take in the rest of the stuff that you might be missing. So even if you look at someone on social media and be like, that person's uncool, not cool at all, trying too hard, just cringe. You'd be like, what am I missing out? You could ask yourself, what am I missing here? What information am I leaving out? Okay, I'm probably leaving out that I don't know anything about this person's personal life or the work that person is actually doing to get here and like doing this on social media, whatever it is. But trying to like open your mind up to what the judgmental mind doesn't want you to see, but just like trying to take in more information.
Yeah, I think another thing is knowing that judgments are trying to keep you safe. If you can figure out why you need that in that moment, like what kind of safety do you need? Do you need to feel accepted by people? Maybe go hang out with your friends. You know, do you need to feel, I don't know, what would other examples be? If you need to feel like you need to work, if you feel like you need to work harder, and so you're telling yourself you're stupid, you're not doing enough, whatever the case may be, then that's a moment for mindfulness maybe. Like, I can work harder without these negative thoughts. Okay, I'm going to go do something that makes me feel generative and productive. So really trying to figure out, like, okay, why is my mind trying to protect me in this way, and how are other ways that I can fulfill that? Yeah. One more tip I saw on a website, it was a Psychology Today article. I really like this as a former relationship OCDer who certainly had and still has a checklist for dating. If you're finding that you're overly picky with men or women, you know, people you date, and you have a checklist, like he's got to be rich, he's got to make this income, he's got to be 6'2", he's, you know, got to have gone to this school or whatever. Try creating an alternative checklist where you first start by, how do I want to feel with my partner? And then notice the qualities that might help you feel the way you want to feel and make that your checklist. So if you want to feel understood, maybe the quality you're looking for is curious and open-minded. Maybe those are two qualities that are important. And so that is much more a checklist created of values. And that can be helpful.
Yeah, I think it sounds like all of our tips are surrounding, like, how do we open our minds and think more flexibly? Like, judgments are narrowing, very rigid, like rule-based, short, fast, quick evaluations. But then how do we slow down? How do we see around that like shortcut and kind of take in other things like, okay, instead of dating for just criteria, how can we date for like other kind of values or or other things that are important in the relationship? Like, how does that intimacy feel?
Yeah. I guess the one last area I want to touch on is sometimes we judge our own emotions, and that can often be a way to not experience them. So if we start feeling really sad, then we say, God, it's so stupid that I'm even sad about this. God, I need to get over it. You know, we might be trying to lift ourselves out of that sadness when that sadness might actually be telling us something important. Like, you need to go feel some connection right now, or just have some alone time, or something like that. So just noticing when maybe judgments are taking the form of like fear of an experience you really need to be having, but you're afraid of. and then maybe dipping your toe in that experience or finding a way to have that experience safely.
That's a good one. Yeah, it's like judgments as like self-invalidation, right? Mm-hmm. Like it doesn't really help. It doesn't help to judge your own emotions, like either makes them worse or changes them to something that's unhelpful or like avoids them completely. So yeah, interesting.
I don't want to feel sad, so I'm going to feel shame instead.
Yeah.
Because everyone knows that's a more pleasant emotion.
At least you have control over it, so who cares?
Yay. Okay, well, Kibby, do you have any resources?
No, but we'll link a lot of the research and that Psychology Today article up on our website, so you can check that out if you want to delve into this topic a little bit more.
Perfect. All right, well, everyone, feel free to judge us positively on Apple Podcasts or Spotify with a 5-star rating, review, and subscription. Do a little help for our friends, and we will see you next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.